Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club for June 2011. A performance right for broadcasting. Will radio begin to pay? And before I introduce our moderator, just want to thank the sponsors of the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club, the Intel Corporation, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, and Public Knowledge. Please give a hand to the sponsors of the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. Our event will be moderated by Drew Clark. He's the founder and publisher of BroadbandBreakfast.com, a news and events company building a community around broadband stimulus, the National Broadband Plan, and intellectual property. And you'll see on the back of your program our upcoming event on Tuesday, July 11th, which is on video streaming on digital devices. Will broadband clash with copyright? So we hope you'll come. And there will not be an event in August, but we hope that we'll continue in the fall with events on every second Tuesday of the month. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. Really happy we have this great panel here this morning. And we did get an email from Ryan Clow of Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren's office. He expressed his regret. The patent bill is holding him up on the Hill. That was the subject of our March Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. So we appreciate his willingness to be on the panel, although he couldn't be here today. We have a really dynamite group here. Let me introduce them briefly. John Simpson is the president of John Simpson Consulting, and many of you in the audience will know him through his role at Sound Exchange for many years. But he also has a great career as he managed country superstar Mary Chapin Carpenter, as well as others. So John is well-versed on this subject, and we'll look forward to hearing his insights. Next to John is Brian Gantman. Brian is a counsel for the Educational Media Foundation and runs the K-Love and Air One radio networks, which are Christian broadcasting stations. Had a chance to talk with him yesterday, and they're a major player on what is clearly an emerging and dynamic space on the airwaves, the Christian music, and he will give his perspectives as a broadcaster. Next to Brian, we have Sylvia Strobel. Sylvia is Executive Director of the Alliance for Community Media, and ACM works with a diverse group of communications entities, and I was speaking with Sylvia. Obviously, they're known for their role with public access, but they're beginning to work a lot more with broadcasting and public broadcasting. So we'll look forward to Sylvia's perspectives too. Then to her left is David Oxenford of Davis Wright Tremaine. Davis represents broadcasting and digital media companies. He's really hawkeye on the Small Webcaster Settlement Act and all of the issues involving webcasting and the performance right that webcasters and satellite radio companies pay. So he can give us his version of the history of the last 15 years or so. And then last but not least, we have Michael Petricone. Michael is Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Consumer Electronics Association and has represented consumer electronic industry positions before Congress and the FCC on many critical issues: digital television, broadband, privacy, home recording rights, and is a great guy, really well known in Washington, and we're really happy that Michael can offer some of the ways that the electronics industry interacts with this debate. So I'd like to go right into our panel and given John the first spot here because he can give us a little bit of a brief history of the performance right, the elusive performance right, and why it's been slow in coming to the United States versus international other companies, other countries.
Sure. We could be here all day, but the brief history. The United States Copyright Act was overhauled in 1909, and songwriters came to Congress. It was John Philip Sousa and the heirs of Stephen Foster, who wrote a lot of great American songs, but who died penniless, even though his songs were being played everywhere. And so Congress enacted a performance right in 1909 for songwriters. And so since 1909, songwriters in the United States have had the ability to get paid when their songs were performed in public. That's what gave rise to organizations like ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, which collect money, about $400 million a year from radio stations, for the songwriters who write the songs. But in 1909, there was no recording industry, so there was no corresponding right given to the vocalists. In the 1920s, the recording industry started to grow, and the first cries for, hey, we should be given equal treatment, people should be paying the singer as well as the songwriter, started to resonate. In the 1930s, it was big band leaders who asked for this right. In fact, they put on their recordings not authorized for radio play because they didn't want radio stations to play their music. You might think, gee, everybody wants radio stations to play their music. These big band leaders actually thought it was going to diminish their marketplace because people wouldn't have to come out and see them live if they could hear them for free on the radio. And if you listen to the first early commercials in radio, it was competing against another technology, the Victrola. Imagine how many records you'd have to buy for your Victrola to hear all the music you can hear on your radio. So that was the early days of radio. It was not about promotion of recordings, it was about substitution. You won't have to buy as many. And I think it still acts as a substitutional force in our lives. You buy less music because you can hear music for free on the radio. But let's fast forward, 1950s. Frank Sinatra was famous for saying, they're playing that song because I'm singing it, not because of who wrote it. But Frank wasn't able to get Congress to pass this, so who were we to think we'd ever get a law passed if Frank couldn't get it done? But we fast forward into the 1990s. I was managing artists, as Drew mentioned, Mary Chapin Carpenter, among others. We formed a coalition. We did get a performance right passed in 1995, but it was only for digital. We were going for the full rights to get paid when radio played songs. We were able to get satellite radio, internet radio, and cable radio services in that 1995 law, as it was also amended by the DMCA in 1998. We did not get over-the-air broadcasters, and in fact, their HD radio signals were also grandfathered so that they would be free even though they look just like digital satellite signals or webcasting signals. So that was kind of the lay of the land that we faced. Now, just to give you an idea in comparison, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has 30 member countries. 29 of them have performance rights for their artists who live in those territories. Every major territory has a performance right for singers, for the recording artists. The only one outside is the United States. And in that respect, we sit in company with North Korea, China, Iran, Iraq, not exactly the company we ought to be keeping when it comes to intellectual property and copyright matters.
But it is true that the United States has a different approach to copyright than a lot of European countries. We have a much more utilitarian view. You have to justify what's the case for protection, and if there isn't a case, if artists would like their songs to be played on the air, then maybe...
My point, I guess, is I create something, I should have the choice. I don't even have the choice to say to radio, as the big band leader said, don't play my stuff. When radio actually went ahead and played their stuff, Paul Whiteman, a big band leader, and Fred Waring in his Pennsylvanias actually sued. Fred Waring won his case in Pennsylvania, that he had the right to control his work. Paul Whiteman won in the lower court and then was overruled in the Second Circuit. And so we've had a differing of opinion here in the United States, but clearly it seems to me if I create something, I should at least have the right. If radio says to me, I'll play it, but you have to give it to me for free, okay, that's a bargain I can make or not make. But I don't even have the right to make that bargain. That's what's unfair about the current status, and that's why Congress needs to pass a law that says, I mean, it is the only copyright in the United States where you don't have the right to control the public performance of your work. The sound recording. Every other copyright has the right to control that.
Well, let me move to Brian. And John mentioned, of course, that broadcasters and their HD signals are grandfathered, but they're not grandfathered as far as their webcast streams. So could you speak about that issue and some of the concrete issues you face as a broadcaster in dealing with this issue?
We for those of you who are not aware, there's an organization called Digital Media. It used to be called Ando Media, and every month it ranks the top 20 streamers in the country and in the world. EMF, which is the organization I work for, we have two streams, K-Love Radio and Air One Radio. They have been consistently ranked as number 10 on that. We are the only non-commercial broadcaster on the list. We do have a discounted rate compared to what Pandora, what Clear Channel, what Slacker pay, but it's still pretty expensive. I went back, and after we spoke yesterday, I looked to find out the exact number that we had paid for the month of April for our streaming. I understand that we are non-commercial. We still paid $49,071.25 for the month of April, and if you factor that in over the course of the year, you're looking at about $600,000 that we are paying. It's very expensive, it's very difficult, it's very time-consuming. It's a place where most people are going. However, if you look at what's going on in the streaming world, Pandora is supposed to issue its IPO this week. They think that they've placed a valuation of about $1.9 billion on it. However, more and more people are coming out and saying, I would not buy, I would not recommend people buy the stock for Pandora. And there's one main reason. You look at the royalties that are being paid out. In the first quarter of the year 2011, they made about $50 million in gross revenues. They paid $29 million of it to Sound Exchange. They had a net operating loss of $6 million. You're looking at a situation where an organization who is the name player in the market, who more people know about, if you say streaming radio, it's almost like Kleenex. People will say Pandora. If you say Cola, everyone says Coke. Sorry to any Pepsi drinkers in the house. But the situation is, you look at these royalties, they are cost prohibitive. People are saying it's not a business model that can succeed. People are saying not to buy their stock. People are pulling out. Jerry Lee, who is one of the owner-operators of one of the largest stations in the country, most successful, WBEB in Philadelphia, he pulled his streaming. There have been times, especially when we tried to cut our deal with Sound Exchange back when they had the Webcaster Settlement Act of 2009, and we got our deal finalized on the final day. I had to tell the people who run our organization, you may have to consider pulling streaming because it is so cost prohibitive. That carries over into the royalty world when you start talking about terrestrial, because if you talk to people at the RIAA, if you talk to people at Sound Exchange, they wish that people were paying more money rather than less. They think that the non-coms were cut such a sweetheart deal, and they think that they should be paying more. If this is the attitude that is taking place in these organizations, what is going to happen if there is a performance right that is granted to Sound Exchange and the recording artist?
Brian, let me interject here. Yes. So this $600,000 that you are paying a year, let's put it in context. How much are you paying for songwriters under the compulsory license for that?
You know, I do not know what we're paying BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC. I think it is in about the $300,000 range, but I am not positive.
But that's for your over-the-air.
That is for our over-the-air.
As opposed to your streaming.
Correct.
I mean, your streaming is some percentage of that $300,000.
Exactly. And if you look, we have got about 663 signals across the country in 47 states.
Right, so you're paying double for your streaming royalties, what you're paying for your ASCAP BMI royalties for your over-the-air signal, which is probably bringing in 50 times as many listeners as your streaming.
Probably even more than that.
Let's actually get some hard numbers here and turn to David for those. So what is the royalty rates that people are paying under the Webcaster, the Small Webcaster Settlement Act, and how do they compare with what might be in store if a performance right for over-the-air were enacted?
Well, actually, it's not the Small Webcaster Settlement Act. It's basically the rates that are being paid by streaming companies based on copyright royalty board decisions and various other settlement agreements that have been entered into with Sound Exchange. The base rate is essentially 1/5 of a penny per song per listener for streaming. And that's the rate that's paid by broadcasters who are streaming. That's the rate that's paid by most streaming companies that are not what are called pure plays. Now, a pure play like Pandora has a lower royalty rate, essentially half the rate that broadcasters and other big webcasters are paying, because there's also a 25% of revenues. It's an alternative. You either pay the per song per listener rate or the 25% of revenues, whichever is greater. Now again, looking at that, 25% of revenue is essentially the minimum which is more than 5 times what streaming companies are paying for ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. Non-commercial stations like the ones Brian works for have separate deals where essentially they get 200, the equivalent of 200 average listeners on a 24/7 basis for $500 a year, and then they pay more based on listening on top of that on a per song, per listener basis, similar to the rates that Pandora or the big webcasters pay depending on the deal.
David, how did these rates get so high? How could it be 5 times more costly to pay for the performance right versus the...
I have the Copyright Office sitting in front of me. Should I really answer that question?
Yes, you should.
There has been litigation at the Copyright Royalty Board. There have been 3 decisions, 2 from the Copyright Royalty Board and 1 from its predecessor, the Copyright Arbitration Royalty Panel, CARP, right, instead of the Copyright Royalty Arbitration Panel. And that's what some of us think about some of these decisions. You know, unfortunately, webcasters have, I think, been at a disadvantage in the proceedings, and I've represented small webcasters in the first 2 proceedings, and I represented the only commercial webcaster that didn't have a settlement agreement because they didn't fit in the pure play deal. They weren't part of the broadcasters. They didn't fit in the small webcaster deal that's out there for very small companies who litigated it. They were the only company litigating against essentially the recording industry. And that's one of the big problems in these royalty proceedings is, you know, John, I love you, and we've debated this many, many times, but you get 18 experts with 25 lawyers on one side of the room, and you get 2 or 3 of us over on the other side of the room bringing in our one expert trying to defend why these royalty rates should be different. And it's unfortunately the webcasting community has never been unified. You've got 4 or 5 different groups of webcasters. You've got broadcasters who are streaming. You've got pure play webcasters. You've got non-commercial webcasters, all of whom are negotiating different rates, different royalties, litigating on different strategies. And unfortunately, you get a decision that many webcasters, like Jerry Lee, like the folks who run Pandora, like the folks who run Rhapsody, who have been trying to negotiate a lower royalty rate because they don't fit under the pure play deal, like many of others, are trying to work out.
Let's get a reaction from John.
Yeah, let me just say that, you know, Dave, the last proceeding where one client decided to go forward is kind of interesting. 90% of the industry settled based on the settlements that were being offered by SoundExchange.
Because they could pay half of what my client ended up having to pay.
But the issue really is in the earlier proceedings, it wasn't as one-sided. In fact, we were up against Clear Channel and Microsoft and AOL. And I mean, it was a very small music industry against a very big technology and communications industry. And we were the ones who feeling like, wow, there's all these experts and all this money being spent on the other side, you know, and it was very difficult for us to defend. Now, let me say that in terms of the rates, the Copyright Royalty Board has shown that they are going to support creators. I think Congress gave a license. This is a compulsory license. No one can opt out of this. So a webcaster of any kind can play any music they want. You do not have the right to say no. So when you set the price for that, you better set a fair market price that protects the people whose music you're using. If someone comes along and doesn't have a business model, that isn't something that SoundExchange has to go and do a deal with. To say, well, you have some, you know, new business model that you think is going to work. I'm not so sure it works. 1/5 of a penny. You heard it from Dave. That's what the big webcasters pay. Pandora pays half of that. 1/5 of a penny to hear a song. And if you can't monetize that at more than 1/5 of a penny, maybe you don't have a business model.
What do you think of the point that Pandora, which you just pointed out, 1/10 of a penny, they're paying more than half of their revenue?
They're still a developing business. And I think what we've seen,
so
for
those
example,
are going to go down as they develop more?
I think what you're going to see is they're going to generate more revenue. And you know, the other thing to understand is the United States is the only place where there is a robust webcasting community given the rates that were set here. Pandora does not operate in any other country in the world because they can't, because the rates are even higher overseas. And these are basically rates that record companies and publishing companies, entities, have said, you know, we don't see a business unless we can make this much return, because it's substitutional. When people listen to Pandora, they don't buy music because they hear a great stream of music. They don't have to buy stuff. If you think about it, and there was a very good article in 2007 that showed satellite radio, which charges $10 a month on average for a listener and gives you 70 channels of music, generates about $120 a year per listener. Over-the-air radio, and you think it's free because you listen to the commercials, but you don't have to pay anything for it, generates about $80 a year per listener from those commercials. Webcasting in 2007 was generating $1 per listener per year because they were not running any ads. They didn't want to run the same kind of ad load that you hear on the radio because that would spoil your experience. And it's kind of interesting when I talk to some of the major webcasters, and I would go out and talk to a lot of these companies, and they'd say to me, gee, when we're simulcasting a major station, we get no pushback when we play 12 ads in an hour because people expect that on radio stations, even when they're simulcast on the web. But as soon as we put a minute of advertising into Last.fm or into Pandora, there was a huge outcry. Uh-oh, you're ruining webcasting because you're now playing ads. The point is, you have to figure out a way to monetize your business to pay for the expenses. And I think, it's just a real, Congress set this up as a willing buyer, willing seller, and we can get into that argument too, Dave. What the standard should be when we have to license. We're forced to license. And so I used to say, my album came out in 1971, sold about 5,000 copies, collector's item. But you don't set the statutory rate at my record or at some young musician who's willing to give it away for free. And there are plenty of people willing to give it away for free who are trying to get exposure.
Let's get
you
some
have
more...
to set the rate at Hey Jude or at one of the, at the major stuff because that's what can be played under a compulsory license where you can play whatever you want.
Let's get some other perspectives into this. Sylvia Strobel, why don't you tell us a bit about how your members in the Alliance for Community Media are approaching this issue?
Sure. Just a little bit of background. I've worked in non-commercial media for 20 years, first 20 years in public broadcasting, and a year ago joined the Alliance for Community Media, which is basically non-commercial public educational and governmental channels, many of which are trying to improve their reach in their communities and diversify and are moving into the low power FM and other non-commercial community radio markets by acquiring stations. So from my perspective, where this is a concern and has been a concern with public broadcasting as well, is the basic business model, because these are non-commercial entities that are having a very difficult time just being sustainable right now. And many also serve as local or hyper-local entry points for a number of new musicians and other types of art form, particularly more diverse voices that you don't always find on the commercial media outlets. And having worked with some public media folks who didn't necessarily fall under the umbrella organization or umbrella contracts negotiated by CPB on behalf of public broadcasting, I know the sheer time that it takes for those organizations to try to comply with some of these reporting obligations, particularly if they're streaming on the web, as well as the cost. And many have had to actually pull their web streams because they didn't have the people or the money to be able to pay and cover that kind of an expense within their own business. One in particular is a national Native American organization that was streaming a lot of native media, native music, and because it didn't qualify under the public broadcasting agreements that had been negotiated for web streaming, it basically had to pull the plug on a lot of the music it was distributing, which was unfortunate. It was a way of getting that music out on the web that really wasn't getting out any other way. So my real concern is with the non-commercial broadcasters. How are we going to create some type of a formula, some kind of a business model that will work for them, that fits within their very, very limited financial means and allows them to continue to provide really critical services to their local communities?
What about public radio and NPR in particular? I mean, they do a lot of music on their shows.
They do a lot of music, and public radio, NPR aside, public radio stations are suffering just like public television, just like a lot of businesses. But certainly in the smaller markets where there are fewer resources, but they provide a really critical service to communities, I think those are the ones that we've really got to look at closely, because we risk them having to change their format and not be able to provide music like they have in the past.
Don't they have a pretty good rate? I mean, David, how does the fifth a penny compare with what public radio
Well,
is
actually,
paying?
public radio has, individual public radio stations have the best of all worlds because they don't pay anything. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting has entered into a deal with Sound Exchange where they make lump sum payments yearly with, I believe, some override based on listenership, where that rate will be adjusted over time. But essentially, the individual stations pay nothing for streaming because CPB is paying for it.
I do just want to clarify, it depends on who falls under the agreement, because there are your traditional NPR affiliates and American Public Media affiliates that do fall, but there are a lot of other community, non-commercial community radio stations that do not fall under those agreements, and that's where there's a real shortfall.
And this is, of course, talking about streaming as opposed to over the air, for which everyone is exempt at the moment.
But you should point out that for small non-commercial stations who don't fit within the CPB agreement, their rate, as Dave pointed out earlier, is $500 a year, flat fee. That's it. And I think any station that can't afford $500, you know, you have to wonder what's budgeted. In fact, just an aside, when we had our proceeding in 2007, it was interesting. Actually, 2006. Harvard Radio came in and said they couldn't afford the fees. They had a budget of $5,000 for pizza and beer for their DJs on their student-run station, but they couldn't afford a $500 fee for the music. And I think that, you know, sometimes radio stations have to think about the fact that they need to pay for their content. $500, you know, a year is very bare bones. I know that there have been some issues with reporting, and frankly, Sound Exchange issued new reporting regulations for really small stations, essentially giving them waivers where they don't have to report if they're under a certain size and under a certain audience size. So they don't even have to report, and I think that that was, again, another, we understood that it was going to cost them more money to report to us than what they were going to pay us.
Let's actually move to that subject of reporting, and I want to turn ironically to Michael, because you know, look, in order to track this, you need to have some means of knowing what's going on over the air. And I assume people are speaking about digital tracking. And could you speak about how CEA has gotten involved in this issue, Michael, and what your perspective is on Sound Exchange and how a performance right for broadcasting would affect this?
Sure. I'm not going to lie to you. CEA and Sound Exchange and RIA don't always see eye to eye on every issue. But I think we can come together on issues that involve simple fairness and common sense. Despite the fact that we sometimes behave like old bickering spouses, we in the content industry have a symbiotic relationship, right? They rely on innovation and the ability of consumers to enjoy rich media on a variety of devices. And we rely on the existence of a vibrant creative community. That's fundamental to us. So with respect to payment of artists whose songs are being played on the radio, I have a hard time understanding the other side of the debate, quite frankly. You know, when a radio station plays Lady Gaga, they ought to be paying Lady Gaga. That's an issue of simple fairness. As was pointed out, every other industrialized nation requires radio broadcasters to do this. The broadcasters say paying artists will push them out of business. That's nonsense. Radio stations all over the world pay artists. They're not pushed out of business. But more importantly, radio's competitors, namely our members, pay artists. As Brian pointed out, Pandora pays $30 million in royalties on $50 million in revenue. Sirius Radio pays, web streamers pay, cable TV stations who stream music pay. So Brian was saying that this shows that performance rights are troubling. I take the opposite lesson, which is why should broadcast radio have a commercial advantage over every other competitor? There's no public policy rationale for this. Basically, this is government-sanctioned unfair competition favoring broadcasters in the form of a giant subsidy. And honestly, this debate has been going on for decades, and it is time for radio to do the right thing.
So, Michael, is CEA supporting the measure to institute a performance right that has passed Judiciary Committee last year?
Absolutely. It's time.
Okay.
And I also think you need to look at the larger context here, which is that over-the-air broadcasters, they have a problem. And the problem is their services are being increasingly rejected by consumers who are going to other media that they find to be more compelling. And one response to this is to make your own service more compelling and bring those consumers back. They have largely chosen not to do that. Rather than adapt to a changing world, they've chosen not to pay performers whose songs they're using on the radio. They've chosen to try to impose performance mandates on other industries. Last year they proposed mandating, they asked Congress to mandate an analog FM tuner into every single smartphone. Think about that. Next, they'll be proposing mandating a telegraph in every single smartphone. It makes as much sense. They have refused to relinquish unused spectrum that is necessary for America's economic future. They've insisted on getting paid for free spectrum, free public spectrum they're using. No, so it is.
Broadcasters were once friends.
But it is time to stop broadcasters from trying to disadvantage other industries and force them to compete in a level playing field. And performance rights is an important part of that.
Let's let Brian respond to that here. Broadcasting, are you innovating enough?
I believe we are innovating. There's different ways we are trying to do things. We are trying to use translators to be able to get out to people. Now, let's look at a couple of things. First off, the argument that we are using the product and that we are not compensating the artist, I think is a complete falsehood. The fact is we are providing promotional value, and I know your eyes are going to start rolling any second now. But the fact is, if we don't play their music, people don't know who they are. I remember at the House Judiciary Committee hearing last year, a member got up there and said, I had to go on vacation and there was no radio where I was going, and I can't imagine where he was going to go, that there wasn't going to be any radio, but he said, I had to go out and buy 2 CDs because there wasn't going to be radio. I think radio is taking away from people going out and buying music. And my question to him would have been, how would you have known what to buy if you hadn't heard it on radio? There was a survey that came out last year that said 51% of the people who watch the Super Bowl are watching the Super Bowl to see the commercials and don't even care about the game. Do we now turn that on its head and say, hey, wait a second, since people are tuning in to watch the commercials on the Super Bowl, are we now going to say that they not only don't have to pay, but they're going to get paid to have their commercials out there? You bring up the argument about how we are the only industrialized nation in the world that is not having this sort of performance right. My understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is most of these countries are getting government subsidies. These radio stations are getting government subsidies, which the United States does not do. We are based on a completely different model. Songwriters get paid because they are not going to have merchandise that's going to be sold. No one's going to go out and say, hey, Jeffrey Steele, I love that guy. I'm going to go out and buy his t-shirt. Concert ticket sales, merchandise sales, album sales, these things all come from it. If you have a problem with the fact that sales have gone down. I was in Best Buy the other day, and I'm looking at the CD rack. Why in the world am I going to spend $17 on a CD when I can go onto iTunes and pick the 1 or 2 songs that I like? I think
that's clearly happening a lot. There's a lot of movement there. But I'd love to get David's reaction to this argument here. Do you feel that it still holds legitimacy that there's a difference between a radio play, because it promotes, it's a promotion value, versus the substitution that is going to take place, and why a songwriter needs to get compensated?
Yes. And there's so many different places I want to go right now. There's so many different things. So, Michael, I don't know how many times I've heard you talking about how your electronics companies should have the rights to use songs as the result of user-generated content without paying the songwriters. And now, you're saying, oh, no. And I agree.
My members pay. Apple pays.
For user-generated content.
They all pay.
For like YouTube.
No, for singers, for artists.
No, but
they pay. They pay a lot of money. Sirius pays. DirecTV pays. They all pays. You guys ought to pay.
But user-generated content they don't pay for. When people, for instance, YouTube, when people are surfing YouTube, they don't pay. And I've heard you many times defend that
our industry pays hundreds of millions to the record labels annually, to Sound Exchange annually.
People who are using digital copies.
But you guys don't. I mean, it's unconscionable.
It's not unconscionable because that's the bargain that has been struck. The reason that the Digital Copyright Act that John sort of glossed over when he was talking about the philosophical issues in 1995 when we got a copyright for performance royalties was dealing with the digital copies that were being made. The fear that people could go out and make digital copies and it would truly become substitutional. The analog copies are not being made. Nobody's out there with their cassette recorders duplicating thousands and thousands of songs from over-the-air radio, even HD radio. Nobody's out there duplicating thousands and thousands of songs from HD radio that's digital. They're out there if they're out there anywhere getting copies from digital copies that are being made, which is why that right was adopted in 1995. You think about the music performance royalty issue. We're not just talking about broadcasters, really. I mean, if you're saying that there should be a performance royalty, and my friends at the Copyright Office have suggested this in the past, why isn't there a performance royalty? Why isn't Clyde's paying when music is played in the background here at Clyde's? Why aren't other venues, concert halls, bars, restaurants, paying for a performance royalty? In the United States, it's been decided long ago that the performance royalty, that the royalties are to compensate the authors of works, not the folks who are merely doing the performance. And I use that word merely. I know. That's
Sinatra, merely, and
yeah, tell me.
Let me ask a question. How many people here can name who wrote the song "I Left My Heart in San Francisco"? Raise your hand if you know it. Who sang the song "I Left My Heart in San Francisco"? Raise your hand if you know it.
Yeah, and Tony
Bennett.
Tony did pretty well with that song, didn't
and
he?
Frank, New York, New York. I mean, the performers are the ones who bring those songs to life and bring them to the public. Without a great performance, you will not have royalties for songwriters.
But,
it does benefit when the sales, everything else. The songwriter that you say is ignored, that's exactly why they get something with BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC, because they're not getting compensated directly. They don't get.
I have a question. For many years, I represented an artist, a guy you might have heard his name, Harry Belafonte. He had a small little song called Deo. Every time you go to a baseball stadium or a football stadium, you hear it, what, 3-4 times a game? Harry gets nothing for that. The songwriter gets paid. There's some unfairness there. They're playing it because of Harry's performance of it, which is this very interesting sounding thing. It's not because of the song. I could sing Deo right now, you'd go out. But if you hear Harry's version, and it's very cool. It's not, Dave, because there was a decision. It's not the bargain that was made. It's because a broadcasting industry that had a much stronger lobbying position has been able to prevent the music industry from getting these rights for 80 years. I mean, let's even think about this. There has not been a copyright in a sound recording until 1972. We had 50 years of a music industry without a copyright in a sound recording because the broadcasters didn't want us to have one because they thought it would come with a performance right. And so in 1972, we had to agree. My record came out in 71, by the way, so I missed out on that. My hindsight was bad. But in 72, we finally got the right to protect our rights under copyright because we finally struck a bargain with the broadcasters. Okay, we'll give up the performance right to get the copyright to protect from piracy and from bootlegging, which was going on at that point. That didn't stop the industry's attempts. In '76, Congress was overhauling the Copyright Act. They said, let's do a study. And the study from the Copyright Office said, there ought to be a full performance right, the Ringer report. And the broadcaster said, yeah, but we don't want to pay. And the trouble is, there are broadcasters in all 50 states who are very powerful. If you're a congressman, to get elected, you have to get on the radio, you have to get on television. So you're very, you spend a lot of money with those broadcasters, with those campaign ads, and you have a very close relationship. The music industry is by and large in about 15 cities. We have artists from every state, and we've done a much better job in mobilizing them and getting them more vocal, which is why we came so close last year. And as Michael points out, the just true unfairness of this particular situation when satellite radio is now paying, and internet radio is now paying, and cable radio is paying, and over-the-air broadcasters who make $14 billion a year using sound recordings, wait a minute, why are the richest people the ones who are doing the best, not paying anything? Well, and you can talk about promotion, Dave.
But you think everybody's a Clear Channel, and not everybody's a Clear Channel. Studies have shown, and I don't know how accurate they are, but studies have shown that we're going to lose 1/3 of our minority-owned and female-owned stations if this goes into place. Funding is difficult to come by. I mean, one of the things that's a benefit to our organization is that we are able to go into some of the smallest communities that are out there. But it's because we get main studio waivers, which means we do not have to staff every single one of those stations. If we had all these extra requirements, it would make it difficult on us too. We are in some of the smallest communities. Those are going to be the communities that are going to be losing their stations. New York will always have stations. Chicago will always have stations. Boston, LA, San Francisco. The problem is you are looking at some very, very small communities. And when I heard like Gloria Stefan get up there and say, it's only $500 a year, $1.67 or $1.37 or something like that a day, isn't that too isn't that a small price to pay for all this great music? Well, how many stations are going to fit under that? What was it? If you had gross revenues of $50,000,
it was $100,000 for $500 a year.
How many stations are going to have gross revenues that are going to be under $100,000? I mean,
there were actually quite a few, and then there was another tier that was $500,000, and you paid $2,500 a year.
But not many are going to fit into that. And if you look at,
you're talking about small town radio stations that are making more than $500,000 a year in revenue.
No, I'm talking about if you talk about. There was a whole bunch of stuff with that. One is a lot of stations aren't going to fit within those tiers anyway, but even if they do, the profit margins on those small town stations are so small that they're going to go away. And if you want to look
a small town station, you're mixing apples and oranges here. Let's talk about small town radio. 80% of small town stations fit within the different exemptions that we provided at last year's performance rights bill.
But you're talking about the top exemption is $1.25 million, which is not adjusted for inflation, and we've had that problem with the alternative.
We're happy to negotiate that particular issue, but $1.25 million, 80% of the stations are covered. We really are talking about the big stations in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York that generate the majority of the revenue. 20% of the stations generating 80% of the revenue of the $14 billion. So we tried very hard, and look, we were always willing to sit down with you guys. We're happy to work out different tiers.
Sat down with you guys.
I know, to work out different tiers. So the issue is, accept the fact there ought to be a right, and then let's work out the details. We don't want to put people out of business, but we want to get paid fairly.
Well, let's get some perspective here. I know we've got a lot of questions in the audience, and this tees it up between the philosophical discussion we're having as well as the practical discussion.
Casey Ray Hunter, Future Music Coalition. It's really interesting to hear the conversations, particularly about public broadcasting, because my organization, Future Music Coalition, cares tremendously about the smaller stations. We also support the public performance right and have done for the 11 years we've been around. I certainly personally feel that there's probably some sort of metric that would make sense for the smaller stations in terms of either exemptions or and maybe some adjustments in what the reporting requirements are. But what really I wanted to focus on and bring the panel back to, if possible, is a conversation about the public performance right for terrestrial radio overseas, because to my view, it's more of an American workers issue. We're providing a great deal of free labor to the rest of the world, and they are not compensating the labor force, the domestic labor force. And when you look at folks being concerned about the American economy and our position on the world stage, this is a huge amount of money that's being left on the table that is the direct product of an American creator class and which is part of the American workforce. And I wonder if anybody wants to take a crack at that.
If I could just address that, when I ran Sound Exchange for the last 10 years, and in that time we did a variety of reciprocal agreements in a number of different territories, actually 5. Out of all of the countries in the world, we were able to get 5 deals done: United Kingdom, Brazil, the Netherlands, Spain, and then we've had a variety of other deals on the table that haven't been passed. And here's the situation. Because of the Rome Convention Treaty of 1961, which protected performers around the world, the United States did not sign that because we couldn't sign it because our broadcasters don't pay our performers. In the rest of the world, what happens when Beyoncé is played in France, the French Collecting Society collects that royalty. They take the money, and the 50% that goes to the owner of the recording gets paid to Sony France. They're a local company. They released Beyoncé's recording in France. Beyoncé is an American artist. They say, oh, the United States doesn't protect French performers in the United States, so we're going to keep Beyoncé's money here in France. Immediately, 25% of her money goes into cultural funds to help support French music education, French orchestras, and then over a period of time, while she still remains unqualified to receive that royalty, all of that money essentially goes into French cultural affairs or gets redistributed among French performers. The same is true in many other countries around the world. So we lose typically somewhere between $100 and $150 million a year. You look at, we've done analysis around the world, 30 to 50% of the repertoire being played around the world is US repertoire. There's about $1 billion that was collected last year on the performance right for performers and copyright owners of sound recordings. So if you look at that, somewhere between $300 and $500 million, again, the copyright owner half is typically getting paid out to the local company because they're a local company. It is independent U.S. companies that don't have relationships overseas that are going to be harmed because they won't get paid, and it's the U.S. performers. And it is a major, major problem when you think about the fact that billions of dollars have been left on the table overseas over the last 50 years.
David, what do you think of that argument? And
There are, though, fundamentally different issues, different rights to overseas than there are here in the U.S. I mean, one major difference is most copyrights overseas end in 50 years. While here they go on, at least 95 years. So, we'd be seeing...
Go on. I thought the reason we passed the Copyright Term Extension Act in 1998 was to be on par with the rest of the world with 70-year terms.
Ours are much longer. I mean, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley would be in the public domain in Europe and places like that. The Beatles will soon be in the public domain in Europe.
Their first album next year. No, Drew, you're right on songwriting. Europe's protection for songwriters is life plus 70 years. And we just recently extended here, Sonny Bono Act, life plus 70 from a life plus 50. But sound recordings have never been protected as long in either place. Typically, they've been works for hire, in which case they're 95 years. And in Europe, it's 50. Arguably, you could say, if they're not works for hire, that they last for the length of the longest living artist in the group plus 70 years.
Are you willing to go for a performance right that limits the protection to 50 years in the United States?
No, I don't see any reason why not. In fact, there's a campaign in Europe to increase their length of protection to the length that we have. I think when... I don't see any reason why. Again, let's get back to the basic issue. I create something, I ought to have the right to make the deal. And again, if I want to give it away free to radio in exchange for radio play, great, if I want to make that deal. But I should have the right to make that deal. Radio shouldn't have the right to say, this is good for you, I'm playing your stuff, be happy.
All right.
If you're, on an oldies radio station, I don't think you're very happy. They're not actually promoting you and selling you. We all know, and the other piece of, radio, I remember back in the late 90s when I was managing artists, and we would go to radio stations and say, you play like 10 songs in a row and you don't even say who you're playing. So, when someone's listening and they, oh, who is that? They have no idea who it is. And we asked radio to, it was called Say It When You Play It. It was a campaign we asked, just consumer idea, that maybe if people heard who the artist was, they might go out and buy things. We were told by Clear Channel, that'll cost you $24,000 a title. So, yeah, we'll sell it to you. So, free promotion? I don't think so.
Well, I know that CBS has actually gone into stating who the artist is and who the title is, and that's something that Dan Mason said that he recently started to implement. But we can't base everything based on what happens with Clear Channel. If you also get into a situation where you say, okay, the artist has a right to say, I don't want you to play my music. What's going to happen, we're going to almost have the Walmart type of situation where the big stations are going to get the best deals because you're going to want them on the stations, and the smaller stations are going to be the ones who are going to basically say, you're getting the scraps, you're getting the leftover, take what we give you, or else you're not going to have any music to play.
Well, your alternative is to cut a deal and come forward and make a payment. We offered very reasonable rates for small stations, and I think that was unfortunate in the last deal. I mean, it was very clearly communicated from the music industry, this is about the top 20% of stations that are making 80% of the money. It's not about the small guys. We're not trying to put small stations out of business. $500 a year, $1,000 a year, when we're talking about 0.5% of your revenue, which is tiny. They pay songwriters 3% on average of revenue. So we were taking less than the songwriters are getting. Typically, everywhere else music is marketed, the recording artist gets far more than the songwriter gets.
David, is the songwriter and the performer actually getting a better deal because they're played over the air? I mean, could you just address this point, the payola point, that there's a real benefit to the artist in being played on Clear Channel?
Yeah, I mean, there sure has historically been, in fact, it still goes on, that there are record promoters out there constantly. The Future Music folks have had lots of reports about this, that there are folks out there going after radio stations to get their music played because it still is the place that music is exposed. Let me sort of focus this debate, and I'll let Casey. I know Casey's going to jump in.
Wait. Can I also take a seat up here? Just a question of fact. When the New York Attorney General looked into the payola issue, didn't he find the payola was being extracted from the record labels by the radio broadcasters? I think extracted was the word that he used.
Are you talking about the Univision case recently?
What do you mean extracted?
No,
I mean, it's being paid by the...
that the broadcasters, the radio broadcasters, were forcing the record labels to pay them the money to play the music. Extracted was the word that they used.
No.
I think it's foolish to try to
that's
argue
right.
that radio airplay doesn't have some type of value, either for the communities or in a baseline promotional sense. But I wouldn't want to conflate the payola issue with the public performance right, if only because the conditions that produced payola behaviors are probably more likely due to the first mover marketplace advantage of the big labels and that relationship that has existed since the dawn of time, and also exacerbated by a hyper-consolidated commercial radio marketplace with very, very few slots for music. And so everyone is competing for a very, very finite slice of an increasingly shrinking playlist opportunity.
But even more important, I think, don't confuse the promotion of a specific artist. Yes, it's promotional for that specific artist who gets on the radio. But is radio promotional in the sense that it sells more records? And that was the point I was making earlier, in that radio actually sells fewer records because you can hear music for free. Imagine this. You're driving to work. You have nothing in your car. There is no radio. If you want to hear music, the only way you can hear it is by buying CDs that you stick into your CD player to listen to on your way to work. You have to buy the music to listen to it. Now, you have radio. Okay, I have a choice. I can put in my iPod that I've programmed and listen to my playlist, or I can put on Diamond in the Morning or whoever it is that I want to listen to, and I am buying less music because I don't need to buy it, because I can put on another form of entertainment. Radio is another form of entertainment.
There'll be more time to listen to CDs.
No,
Let's get rid of cable.
But that's not the point, Dave. That's not the point.
iPads. Let's get rid of those too. They take. Sure it is, John. I mean, where are you going to listen? Where are you going to find out what CD to listen to?
Television stations pay for their programming.
Different story, because it's not based on resales, not based on merchandise sales.
Wait a minute, Charlie Sheen can go out and tour now based on his hit show.
Did you pay to go see him?
No. Okay. I'm an educated consumer. I did my research.
I hope nobody in the room wants to see
Let's
Charlie
get another
Sheen.
question here.
Hey, Eric Huey, Entertainment Software Association, and we have no dog in this hunt. But just from a pure academic perspective, I want to go back to, Michael, the point you made about subsidies. It seems to me that this subsidy really is the operative word here, because you have a government-sanctioned subsidy of the radio business on the backs of record companies and consumers, and perhaps on the backs of the nascent competitors. In the history of American industry, when we want to bring in new competitors to compete against an entrenched entity, you give the competitors a break. You don't necessarily hobble them with something that the entrenched operator has an obligation that they don't have. So the question I would have is, in terms of going back to the rate question that David and John were debating, if you were able to reach some sort of arrangement, either legislatively or through negotiation, with the radio operators, where they began to, at long last, pay a public performance right to performers, would that cause, or could there be a scenario whereby that would cause the rate that broadband radio providers, the Pandoras and others, their rates would actually go down? So there was a normalization of the rates, and so that everybody could be made whole in an equitable way.
That's a really good point. I think what you would likely see happen is the broadcasters obviously have a lot of leverage. This is a right that the music industry has been after for 80 years. And in fact, last year, there was an agreement on the table at roughly 1% of revenue, which, as I said, is about a third of what songwriters get. To get record companies to agree to get less than publishers get is incredibly rare. There were many people on my side who were arguing against this deal because we thought it was too low. And in fact, in Italy, where the rate is, and Berlusconi, of course, who owns media stations, I think there might be a coincidence, but maybe not, they're limited to 2% of revenue. And we've always fought very hard through the international bodies that I've been a part of to try to get that limit, that ceiling raised above 2%. And here we were in the United States talking about 1%. But of course, it was 1% of 14 billion. So it's a much bigger number than in any other territory. But if the broadcasters came in, it's clear that they could say, okay, we will pay you over the air, but we want a discount online. And if the broadcasters got that discount online, obviously the next time we go into a rate proceeding with webcasters, Dave is a very good advocate. He's going to be sitting there going, broadcasters are now paying this. Why are webcasters? You know, there will clearly be a movement. So I think, is it inevitable if a broadcast rate gets passed and the rate comes down? Maybe not.
David, let me come back to this issue of equity between the webcasters and the broadcasters. And you're making the philosophical point. You're defending broadcast is an analog medium by and large, and so there's really a difference with the digital transmission. But you know, when we're really looking at the equity and the point of the kind of the new guys get the tax, whereas the established players don't. Is that really fair to the new entrants, the new companies?
And let's not call it a tax. It's a royalty.
Is it fair? I mean, again, the philosophical reason that it was adopted in the late 90s had to do with digital copying. And, you know, I don't think that fundamental difference has changed. You're still not getting, you don't get people making multiple copies of analog or over-the-air broadcast.
So it's the risk of the fact that a digital stream can become a copy that justifies its higher royalty?
That's what justified the performance royalty for sound recordings here in the United States.
That's not exactly true. That was one of the rationales, but another rationale was Congress saying, you know, it's wrong that that broadcasters have had this subsidy, have had this exemption. We're not going to allow this exemption to exist in new technologies.
If that was the case, then they would have put in a broadcast performance royalty.
It was pure power and lobbying. Your client's lobbying power just, you know, basically trumped. We tried to get the full broadcast right.
Or bars and restaurants would have gotten.
Well, I'm happy to talk about that as well. As I mentioned, I think stadiums ought to be paying when Harry Belafonte stuff's being played in a stadium. Everywhere else in the world, when you're in a cafe and you're hearing music, they're paying the recording artist as well as the songwriter. It's fair. It is only fair. When you're in a doctor's office, I might get in trouble for saying this, but you know, dentists understand the principle, the value of music. They can either give you more Novocaine or play Kenny G, you know? And so,
Megadeth.
No, yeah, Megadeth. No, I mean, relaxation, music relaxes you. I mean, it does in that setting. And that's why they play soft jazz, whatever they play. And, you know, gets you in the right mood. You know, in the Netherlands, farmers are paying recording artists because they play music to cows because they produce more milk. It's true.
You know, in Europe, movie theaters also pay the performers in the movies. There's fundamentally different structures of who gets paid in various copyright schemes.
Because we've been prevented from getting a full performance right by the broadcasting lobby and the restaurant lobby for the last.
The movie theater lobby.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. Well, no, in the movie. Let me say this: in movie theaters, there is a different issue because in movies, when you see a song in a movie, when you hear a song that's played in the movie, the recording artist and their record company made a deal to put that song in the movie with the motion picture producer, and they got paid for it. And you know, and sometimes that payment can be 6 figures. So if you're, you know, getting the title song of a major motion picture, you know, you've given away that right, but you've negotiated that right. In this case, you have no negotiation rights.
You have come back to the different philosophical approach to copyright the U.S. has versus the others. Michael.
Back to the point that was raised over here. The fact that the broadcasters pay nothing and my members pay hundreds of millions of dollars is a titanic subsidy. And the problem with subsidies is that subsidies make our economy less efficient. And then this is replicated, of course, on the broadcast side, where the TV broadcasters have been given free use of hundreds of billions of dollars in broadcast spectrum that is only being viewed by about 9% of the population, and they now refuse to relinquish for more economically productive uses. And I gotta say that right now, with our economy in the state that it's in, we can no longer afford these subsidies and these inefficient structures. I mean, it has to change.
Let's get a question from.
Hi, I'm Adam Bender with ComDaily. You know, this is an issue that comes up in Congress, and has come up in Congress, you know, many years. I guess given the current political climate, you know, how do the panelists see, you know, the chances of this moving ahead in this current Congress, and if not now, you know, when might there be the right conditions?
Well, you had mentioned that they had gained strength last year in trying to push the Performance Rights Act through. It did pass the House and Senate Judiciary Committees.
Conyers was a very strong supporter, so was Leahy. You also had Senator Feinstein from California. Obviously, when you have Tennessee and California people, they are very, very strongly in support of this.
And New York,
However,
yeah.
they did have the Local Radio Freedom Act in the House and in the Senate, and I believe in the Senate they had, 27 co-sponsors in addition to the 2 sponsors, and on the House side they had, I believe, 262 co-sponsors. It was reintroduced this year, February 28th. On the Senate side, I believe they have 16 or 17 co-sponsors already, and there is no Performance Right Act out there. And on the House side, I believe it's 156, 160 or so co-sponsors, in addition to Mike Conway of Texas, who brought that. So I don't know that last year it was as close as people would have you believe, because you already had about 45 members more than you need signing on to this resolution opposing the imposition of a performance right. And this year, without even having the performance right on the table as legislation, you've already got, close to 160 or so people who have signed on and said, we do not believe that this is appropriate. So
and again, this is a non-binding resolution. It's not legislation. It's a non-binding resolution not wanting to put a tax on America's broadcasters.
You use the word tax.
I know. And I think it's interesting to note, that, and again, it shows the lobbying power of the broadcast industry, that without even a performance right being introduced in this Congress, they went out, had their non-binding resolution, which is very easy to sign on to. It's kind of like, July 12th will be John Simpson, reunion tour day, because I'm going on a reunion tour with my band. No, I don't know. I mean, they pass these things all the time. But
let me ask it this way: as our friend Michael Petricone at the end says, broadcasters are getting beat up on lots of fronts, on spectrum, on diminishing number of people watching television, Pandora, iTunes, people getting their music. If you can't get a performance right through, given the diminished role of broadcasters, when can you get a performance right through?
Can I cut you off for just 1 second? Is it really a diminished role of broadcasting? I mean, we have about 250 million people who on a weekly basis are tuning into radio, and I don't know what the numbers are, but pretty much all of the top 10 shows are the major networks, Fox, NBC, ABC, CBS, so they may be getting it on cable or through satellite, but a lot of people are also starting to cut those because of the economy. So I wouldn't say that broadcasting has a diminished role. We are still the people that people lean to when there ever is an emergency. I went to the rally to restore sanity with my family. I couldn't get a signal out there. I was at the FCC Future of Media workshop, and somebody brought up how there was a situation where they found there was a diminished, the signal was, there was a severe deterioration in the signal that people were receiving on the internet, and they couldn't explain it. So they went back and they found out that the presidential motorcade was going by, people were taking photos, downloading them to Facebook, and emailing them to their friends. If that is what is happening, just when the presidential motorcade is going by.
You just made a tremendous and persuasive case for why we need more wireless spectrum. Thank you.
No, what I'm saying
now, incentive auctions, please.
Either that or analog tuners in every cell phone, right?
What I'm saying is, if you've got 200,000 people on the mall, there is a finite amount of spectrum. You will never have enough spectrum for all the people that are out there. People are still going to radio and TV because they know that is there when they need it. A text message is not going to cover people in case of an emergency. If a tornado is coming through, it is not going to tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. So, I don't think broadcasting's role has been diminished. I know what Gary Shapiro says.
But it's the facts. It's like 9%. We'll come back in a couple of years and we'll have this debate again. It'll be 6%. After that, it'll be like, at a certain point, you got to acknowledge the numbers.
We are one to many.
It is what it is.
You are 1 to 1.
But consumers are making their decisions and they're picking other forms of media. So it's what it is.
It's supplementing radio. It's not taking away from radio.
But they're not watching it over the air. It's a fact. I mean, we can discuss opinions, but we got to agree on the facts.
You're talking TV. He's talking radio.
My question is, if you
on the radio. Wait. Let's talk about that. Wait. We can talk about the facts on the radio
spectrum,
too.
Why not put the FM chips in the cell phones? Because then that's going to mean that fewer people are streaming online, which means that there's going to be more spectrum available.
available.
Because that's the height of absurdity. What you're saying is that nobody is listening.
Why is it the height of absurdity?
Yeah, because what you're saying is that nobody's listening to our product, and listenership for radio is going down. So we're going to make you listen. We're going to make you listen.
I didn't say listenership was down.
Well, why not implant FM tuners in like people's pillows? Well, it's absurd.
I just want to jump in. For anyone that's read through
Sylvia,
the
go
500
ahead.
pages of the, I call it Future of Media report that came out by the FCC last week, I was actually surprised to see that radio is alive and well.
Yes.
And as noted in that report, it's doing very well. People are using it for many, many different purposes.
And the time spent listening really hasn't gone down.
Well, no, but it has. The recent survey by Bridge Ratings shows that younger people prefer internet radio over broadcast radio by 2 to 1.
But that's not actual time
spent listening. The U.S. Census Bureau has shown that time spent listening to radio is down by 10% over the last 5 years. And Edison Research Survey showed the same thing. I mean, facts are facts.
From 98 to 97.2, I think it is, % penetration on an average day. I mean, any of your companies would love a 97% penetration.
Dave, the last figure I saw was about 237 million people a week tune into radio, which is a huge number. I mean,
it's a huge number.
it is down, but it's still 237 million, which is why we still need to get paid when radio broadcasters make $14 billion using sound recordings.
Are there other questions out there? Yes.
Yeah, I guess I can't. I'm Larry Landis with the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, and I guess I cannot let the comments with regard to putting FM tuners into radio and that whole situation, the argument with regard to spectrum, go unchallenged. Shortly before the FCC came out with the National Broadband Plan, which amounted to nothing more than an industrial policy with regard to spectrum, there was a study done nationally and globally by Merrill Lynch that showed that the overwhelming need for spectrum that the FCC argues for is not proven. Ivan Seidenberg has said that it's not necessary. And yet we have these arguments with regard to, well, we need to have all the spectrum shoved into cellular technologies. But beyond that, 2 years ago, we sponsored a resolution in which we supported the idea of putting an FM chip into the cell phones. The cell phone lobby was able to defeat that. And in the meantime, they're moving ahead with a solution that's based on texting when half the population has never acknowledged receiving or sending a text. So I can't let these arguments go without challenging them. I'm fascinated by the circularity of the arguments. On the one hand, radio is a dying medium, but on the other hand, it's a monopoly, and we need to break down the monopoly, and have payments made to performing artists. Well, why? Because everybody's listening to radio. I mean, where's the logic in that?
You want to reply to that, John?
Well, I've never said that radio is either a monopoly. My justification is we have property that someone else is using, and they don't want to pay us for it, and they've been able to get Congress. Well, I mean, by Congress's inaction, we've not been able to get the right to get paid. We don't even have a choice. So, to me, I'm going to support Michael's companies, satellite radio, internet radio, cable radio, because they do pay us. And if we look at broadcasters, they do pay us when they have to simulcast online from websites. Originally, they took the position they didn't have to pay, that they were exempt from that as well under the 1998 law. And it was only after Copyright Office issued regulations and they sued the Copyright Office, Bonneville versus Peters in 2003, and lost, that they started paying. So the broadcasters, are now paying us for online streaming. But, my argument is strict. Let's have a level playing field. Everyone should be paying. You should not be putting this this exemption on the one company that can afford, or the companies that can afford to pay it the easiest, $14 billion a year. I like to mention that number because it's a big number.
Let's spend the last few minutes we have discussing the pragmatics of this actually passing. Now, the White House and the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator has come out in favor of a performance right. It was part of their March report. What do each of you panelists feel is the chance, the percentage chance that a performance right will pass in this Congress, either this year or next year? And what's going to happen as we get towards that point? Is there going to be negotiations with different parties striking deals? Is it going to be a flat global rate? What are each of your perspectives on this point?
Yeah, okay. First of all, your comments were interesting. I can't let the assertion there's no spectrum crisis go unchallenged. Look, it is very rare that the Democratic White House, the Democratic FCC, and the Republican Congress agree on much of anything, especially these days. But they all agree that broadband is a national priority. They all agree that our future competitiveness expressly depends on access to this scarce resource. And they all agree that we need to reallocate our nation's spectrum more efficiently. Wireless traffic is going to quadruple by 2015. You walk through the International Consumer Electronics Show, which is a wonderful show, which you were all invited to, by the way. And
are you flying us out there?
We can talk. I'll throw in a dinner. And there were about 20,000 new products introduced this year, which is great. The vast majority of them rely on wireless licensed or unlicensed spectrum. So we clearly have an issue. I mean, there may be some who disagree, but the vast majority of people acknowledge it. And the question is, how do you handle it? What do you do? In terms of the bill, I think there is a recognition that this is a just thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But the broadcasters are on a variety of issues, a very, very, very powerful lobby. So we'll see what happens.
Let's go down the line. David, what's your take on that?
I don't see much action on it right now. And there's still the opportunity for talks between broadcasters and the recording industry. I think Gordon Smith, the head of the NAB, has said that they're open to discussing this issue, so we'll see where it goes.
Having legislation in front of Congress right now that we had hoped would move in the last session with a lot of Ds and is now actually getting traction with Rs, I would not venture to guess what's going to happen in this Congress. It's a crapshoot. It really is. But I will just say that if negotiations continue where community media is concerned, we have to remember that many, many non-commercial media outlets are not covered under blanket agreements by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and really don't have strong negotiating leverage on their own part. They simply don't have the resources. Many are also operating with a lot of in-kind from colleges, universities, and governmental entities and have annual operating budgets of $10,000 to $20,000 a year. So we've got to make sure they don't get lost in the shuffle.
I don't think it'll pass this Congress, at least not as a standalone bill. I think the only chance it has is if someone can get it thrown into an appropriations bill, kind of like what people were concerned about during the lame duck session of Congress. I don't think the fact that the Obama administration has signed on and said we think that this is appropriate is any different than what happened with the Bush administration, because the Bush administration took the same position, and it didn't go anywhere. So standalone doesn't have a shot. And but the fact is, the NAB is willing to talk to Sound Exchange and the RIAA and Music First, and I believe the ball is actually in Music First court at this point. So, but they're still open to talking.
I would probably agree that if this is, especially given all that Congress has to deal with at the current time, this is only going to move forward if it's a negotiated settlement that Congress is essentially being asked to sign off on. Where the parties have come to the table and sat down and had an agreement. I just don't think the climate's right, but that doesn't mean, this issue won't go away. It's not gone away for 80 years. It'll be here until it gets passed and until fairness finally triumphs. Sounds like the great ending of a Hollywood movie. Of course, I guess, are we streaming those on your devices?
And
yeah, I hope.
It is a great ending to our panel today. But before we conclude, two quick announcements. First off, you do have surveys in front of you. If you'd be kind enough to fill them out and put them on the table on your way out, we'd appreciate it. Our next Broadband Breakfast Club will be next Tuesday, and it will be on the National Broadband Map. So for those who are interested in broadband, next week event will be up your alley. And the next Intellectual Property Breakfast Club will be video streaming on digital devices. Will broadband clash with copyright? And that will be on July 11th. So before we dismiss, I'd like you to join me in thanking our sponsors, Intel Corporation, National Cable and Telecommunications Association, Public Knowledge, as well as each of our panelists, and for each of you for participating. So please join me.